I'd love to first just get your take on this huge turnaround and ultimate victory for the Liberal Party of Mark Carney's Liberal Party. What message do you think that the Canadian people have sent?
Well, thanks for having me first off. And I think, as we know, Canadians saw this election as one of great consequence. And really, we ended up with the election timing in a very different economic moment than the country was in just a few months ago. So that meant the ballot box questions, shifted with the onset of tariffs and really with the break in what Canadians have known for a long time in that stable relationship between the Canadian people and Americans. So I think at the core, when people headed to the polls, there was this anxiousness looking for economic relief, both at the individual level for cost of living challenges, but now those challenges put in a broader context and external threat. So voters were looking not only for the policy that would support and bolster the Canadian economy, but also for the person they knew they wanted to send into negotiations with the Trump administration.
And of course, who is there in Ottawa makes such a big difference for your tens of thousands of members at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Candace. We heard there from President Trump saying that he's ready to make a deal with Canada. Mark Carney, both through his campaign and since securing, again, the prime ministership, has taken more of a hard line. Is that the tone that you think makes the most sense out of the prime minister?
Well, I think what matters most, and I heard President Trump say this himself, is the conversations between the two of them versus the comments made, by either of them, during a campaign or to their constituents. And so I think we're happy to see that, relations and discussions so far have had a positive tone. And I think we're just relieved, the Canadian business, community, that we have a government now that's going to be back at work. We had prorogation, January, March, and then headed into an election. So we've really had our parliament, closed for business. And now we're just relieved that we can turn into real discussions, real negotiations about our critical trade relationship with the United States.
Well, Mark Carney, in his victory speech, said that the economic relationship with the U.S. is over in the shape and form that it had been. Is he correct?
I would agree, but it's a broader aperture I would take on that comment is that, we are in a shift, a rebalancing of a lot of aspects globally. And so I think, the best way, forward is through to a new version that actually addresses some of the challenges, the irritants, the things we know that need to be, serving global trade in a better fashion. And this is, Dani, where we head into not only Canada having discussions with the United States, but leading discussions for the upcoming G7 summit. And ahead of that, just in a few weeks, the B7 summit, where business leaders from all those same countries gather to talk about what's the best path forward for global trade. How do we address some of the irritants and struggles and, work with like-minded countries on some of those irritants and address non-market practices that we need to tackle together.
Well, China has certainly been pitching itself as a place that global companies, that global governments can turn to in the absence of the U.S. I know the Chinese ambassador to Canada made similar comments to that degree not that long ago. Do you think it would make sense to see stronger ties between Canada and China at this moment?
Well, with ties right now, it's very interesting because as Canada deals with many tariffs, we have the original border fentanyl tariffs and we have sectoral tariffs, from the United States as well. But there is an important third bucket of tariffs. I call them the boomerang tariffs, which are from China on Canada right now. And that's 100% tariffs on canola and peas and pulses and 25% tariffs on pork and other goods. And that's in retaliation for Canada's alignment with the U.S. on EV tariffs and steel tariffs from last year. So I think right now Canada is receiving a very clear message from China, if you align, you're in trouble if you align with the U.S. So it's a very interesting moment. And I think as we head into the G7 and B7 discussions, this is where we really need the US administration to come help lead those discussions and that plan going forward on, how do we maintain multilateral collaboration to address some of the concerns in the trade with China.
It certainly feels like Canada's between a rock and a hard place. But Candace, if we just look at American tariffs, U.S. tariffs on Canada so far, 25% on autos, aluminum, and steel, a similar one on Canadian exports that don't fall within the U.S. MCA. You represent many businesses in Canada. What has been the impact on them so far?
Well, the impact, even before the tariffs came into effect, just the threat of tariffs puts a chill across all business because of the uncertainty. How do you take decisions on anything when you don't know the impacts? You can't forecast. You can't issue your guidance with a level of confidence. And now I would say that shift has gone, from a chill to a complete freeze for a lot of businesses. They're trying to hold off on layoffs if they can, but they're definitely holding off on decisions, on investment and capital flows. So the impacts are great, but some of them are not as well seen as others. And so even though there's reprieve, with an extended indefinite deadline on the original tariffs of 25%, anything that would be CUSMA or USMCA compliant, we're finding businesses are scrambling because many hadn't done the paperwork to make sure they were CUSMA or USMCA compliant. It's quite a process from goods coming out of Canada, dealing with the rules of origin, and then those receiving those goods in the United States, making sure that all the paperwork is done to ensure compliance with our trade agreements. So there's all these knock-on effects from the tariffs, in addition to the obvious direct impact costs, whether they're being absorbed by businesses or passed on to consumers.